Well, hi everyone, and welcome to Chapter 8, Week 8 of the semester. This week we tackle the beginning of economic geography. This week's part of economic geography has to do with primary activities. It is, I think, a pretty straightforward depiction and look at geography. It's not an economics class, so don't worry, but it's how the activities that we considered primary come to be. And you all take part in this. You're all consumers. Everything you eat, almost everything you put on in terms of clothing, your iPhone, your Galaxy, your Google phone, your iPad, your MacBook, your Microsoft tablet, whatever it is you use, maybe the very device you're listening to this on, is a function of primary activities. Can't get away from it. So when you look at this, when you look at a container ship, when you look at something like the Airbus A380, when you look at oil tankers, when you look at trains, each of them, and the question I ask here is, what do these images say about the state of today's economic activities? And what I hope you get out of this is that they are linked. If you are in the Airbus industry and this particular plane, the wings come from one part of Europe, the fuselage comes from Germany, the tail comes from Spain, the French do the wings, and the engines come from England. So it's a joint effort. It's all sort of brought together. It's a European venture, clearly. Of course, if you own a hoodie or you have a cool new iPhone case or something that you may not even think about, it probably came in some container ship and it basically made landfall in Florida, New York, Los Angeles, Seattle, and it was put on a truck and it was sent to the Google distribution center. So when you logged on to your Amazon Prime account and you ordered it, it came that way. Or you went to Walmart or Target, or you went to your local mall, or whatever the case might be. It's all connected. It's all part of globalized trade and economics. Of course, oil, even though we're in a world where we're hoping to become more self-reliant on renewable resources, that's still not truly the case. And as a result, we still depend on oil, and that oil comes from all over the place. So economic geography is a study of how people earn their living, the livelihood systems, and how they vary by area, and how economic activities are spatially interrelated and linked. And hopefully by now you get that really everything in geography is linked to some degree or another. Of course, primary activities, which is what we're going to focus on, has to do with agriculture. So the growing of the corn that's going to be turned into corn syrup, which is going to be added to almost everything you eat, or palm oil. And if you like to wear lipstick, lip balm, if you wear makeup, if you like to eat chocolate, if you eat a Nissin cup of noodles, if you use soap, guess what? You're all consuming more than likely palm oil. It's inescapable. Extractive industries have to do with extracting things like metals and ore and other such items, or wood, lumber, fishing, mining. All those things are part of this sort of economic realm. Okay, so the classification of economic activities and economies. So again, those activities that extract or harvest something. Secondary activities, and we'll get further into this later on, is when you take those activities and those resources like ore or like wood or food, and you turn them into something. So you turn corn into corn syrup, and corn syrup gets added to ice cream or any other food item as a function of making it more economical to buy. Okay? So that's the idea of the classification of activities and and how you sort of look at it from the perspective of spatial extent. Now, if you are curious, every time you eat something, when you drink that Diet Coke, or when you eat that packaged food that you spent 75 cents at the vending machine, look at the ingredients. Guess what? It's kind of scary, isn't it? And that stuff came from somewhere, and that somewhere is probably nowhere near New York. That's just one of those things. We'll get into tertiary and other services. That's really more for next week, next lesson. But here's a way of looking at geography from the perspective of everything you see in the blue means oceans shipping to and from a major port. So, of course, oil here in Saudi Arabia, in Japan, in Malaysia, in Europe, throughout the Mediterranean, New York, of course, Houston, New Orleans, the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal. So these are all routes that are significant, and they're significant because these are the routes that basically take your stuff to you. They bring it to you. And then in the white areas within 20 miles of either a road, a railroad, or an inland waterway. Look at the US and Europe. And look at the US and Europe compared to everywhere else where you see that brown. That brown means you're not within 20 miles of a road, a railroad, or an inland waterway. And why is that significant? Because you have to spend more time and money to get this stuff to you. Does that make sense? So access to water, roads, and rail makes all the difference in the world. Look at most of Russia, look at Saudi Arabia, look at Africa, look at South America, look at the US. Remarkably accessible to everything. So is Europe. That is economic advantage. Even China doesn't fully have that advantage just yet. These are the types of economic systems: subsistence, commercial, and planned. Subsistence is where you basically do something to help yourself survive. Commercial is where you sell. And planned implies the government's in charge. So the old Soviet Union, for example. Subsistence. And here's an example of subsistence agriculture, places where there's shifting agriculture, nomadic herding, and sedentary intensive agriculture. Commercial, where it's really dominant throughout most of the world. And so the idea here is producers and their agents freely market their goods and services. And then, of course, planned. So North Korea nowadays, the former Soviet Union, and the communist states that were associated with it. Here's the idea of agriculture. Places where agriculture plays a significant part or role in gross domestic product. Look where it is most dominant. Sub-Saharan Africa. So in North America, even Mexico, Canada, the US, Europe, Australia, agriculture is significant, but it's really not that big a role of their GDP. They don't make the majority of their money used through agriculture. It comes various other means. Again, and to go with this one, this is agriculture. And then of course, places where there's, where the climate is conducive to agriculture, where there's no frost. Percentage of total employment in agriculture. Look at the idea of high income countries like the US versus less developed countries like in Africa or in parts of South and Southeast Asia. That's the percentage of the job market is really high in agriculture, 60 or greater, whereas in the US, it is less than 5%. So here's a little case study, the Sahel. This is a region of Africa in the blue. And that's a region that's not quite desert, but it isn't quite a tropical jungle. So the rainfall is seasonal. It only comes during the summer. And during the winter, no precipitation at all. They have one river system, the Niger. And the precipitation varies from March to September. And that's the vegetation, again, March to September. And as a result, you get this, you get subsistence farming, where the farming is there to basically provide the needs of a local community. And you get nomadic herding. Here's a video that's linked, and I'd like you to take a look at it online. It's about fighting erosion and desertification in sub-Saharan Africa. So let's look at different systems of agriculture. So you have extensive subsistence. You have nomadic herding, the idea of shifting cultivation, which is more commonly referred to as slash and burn. And here's what slash and burn looks like. You burn a piece of land. That burned material provides food and nourishment to the soil. You grow a crop, but then you leave it because inevitably the heavy rains that follow will wash away the nutrients of the soil, rendering it useless. So you burn another tract of land. And this is a very damaging enterprise. It does really, really bad damage to the soil. So this is what it looks like in a place like Madagascar. Notice how much dirt has flowed out into the ocean, turning the ocean from nice and blue to almost like chocolate milk. And there's a video, again, linked on Blackboard about slash and burn in tropical Honduras. And the video shows you the potential worldwide impacts of fixing it and how there's a possible way of fixing it. Subsistence agriculture, intensive kind, and then urban agriculture. So you could do the idea, you could think of vertical farming. So think about the idea of farming in cities, farming at the top of on a rooftop in New York, and actually growing food you could eat. And that may seem far-fetched and in the distant future, but that's a possibility, and that's coming as the technology gets better, as buildings are able to support the weight of a plot of land on top of it. Here's the idea of yields per capita production in Asia versus Africa. And unfortunately, in Africa, there's been sort of a downturn as you move in time compared to a place like Asia, where the uptick has been significant in terms of production of cultivated areas and the yield of that cultivated area. Let's actually get into commercial agriculture. This is what we practice in the US. Farmers produce not for their own subsistence, but for a market to make money, basically. And so, for example, in the US, there's a lot of money involved. And when you fly over the US, you get to see this. You get to see a landscape that's been completely reinvented. And it does not look natural. Earth should not look like that. It shouldn't look like a whole bunch of little squares or circles. But that's because it's been completely reinvented to suit the needs of commercial agriculture. That's where we grow wheat and corn and whey and all kinds of other cash crops that allow the US to make a lot of money with few workers because a lot of it is automated. So this is true in the US and in Canada. Extensive commercial agriculture is that commercial agriculture that is less, where the lands are least productive. Maybe the climate isn't as good. Maybe it's drier and colder and therefore harsher. And as a result, you get to grow things that don't require as much water, or where livestock ranching, you can have those animals basically depend on basically poor grasses to exist. And as a result, you get the map like this, where you tend to have trucking and fruit farming in the dark green. Notice Florida, coastal US, where there's lots of rainfall. Range livestock in this green. And this is not these are really unproductive land. The soils are not as good. And then of course you have this red and this brown, where you have general farming, corn, wheat, food, any of those staple crops that you think about, or what's referred to as the Corn Belt: Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. And so this is basically, once you get into the north, New York, New England, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, that's dairy farming, where you're basically raising cows not to butcher them and turn them into meat, but for dairy, cheese, milk, and so on. So this is what commercial agriculture looks like in the US and in southern Canada. Let's see, the next part of this would be economic activities that are non-agriculture. So that would be logging, and of course, fishing and mining. So here's an example of looking at the idea of resource in the US from the early 20th century into the early 21st century, and the change from wood to coal to oil. And eventually, as you get into the 2020s, this oil part is getting definitely smaller. So what is a resource? And a resource is the mostly natural occurring materials that human populations, regardless of who they are, consider necessary and advantageous. So they're renewable. And an example of renewable would be sun, wind, water, and non-renewable: oil, natural gas, coal. Pretty simple, right? Pretty straightforward. So here's the idea of development of primary activities, and do you have the technology to exploit them? What is the cultural awareness of their value? Right now, China, for example, is heavily investing in Africa because Africa is full of resources. So China is developing in infrastructure and in other, roads and ports and that kind of thing, because China is in dire need of these resources in order for their economy to support over 1.3 billion people. So let's look at fishing, and let's look at the idea of what fishing is and what commercial fishing is. It is usually within about 200 miles of the US coast, or any coast, but in the US, that's normally the distance Usually you associate fishing areas where you see this sort of blue color, and that would be this. And generally speaking, associated with cold currents, because cold water is usually the most nutrient-rich water. It's not exclusive to that, but there are many parts of the ocean that you could consider them to be deserts because there's hardly any life that's sort of worth harvesting. But when you're doing fishing, you have to be careful you don't get into a thing called the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons is when you have a host of, for example, fishermen, and they go out and they get whatever they can. And they don't observe any kind of limit. And if everybody does that, then eventually everybody runs out. So the fishing industry is very well managed and regulated, and it's so that you do not run out of the resource that you're essentially depending on. So that's the idea of the tragedy of the commons. That applies to many things, but for example, logging and fishing are two of the big ones. Here's the idea of fishing, aquaculture, and some of the problems that are included with it. Aquaculture is sort of like agriculture, for example, salmon farms, where you don't catch the salmon out in nature, you basically grow them in big tanks. And that aquaculture has taken off since the mid-1990s. Here's the marine capture bar, and here is the freshwater capture bar. But notice the only one that's actually grown significantly would be aquaculture. Forestry, of course, most commercial grade forest harvesting is conducted in the upper mid-latitudes of the Northern Hemisphere and in the equatorial zones of Africa, South and Central America, and Southeast Asia. Specifically, conifers and pines up here in Canada, in the US, Northern Europe, Russia, and of course, those very distinguishable tropical things like bamboo and cedars and other tropical woods that are very highly sought after. And forestry has to be managed as well because you can easily exhaust the resource if everybody doesn't take care of it well. It's sort of like a Christmas tree farm, if you've ever been to one. If you've been to one, you know that a Christmas tree farmer is made up of lots of areas of tiny little pine trees, small pine trees, slightly bigger pine trees, medium size, big, and ready to be harvested. So every season they plant a new crop so that years down the road that will be available. Otherwise, you run out. So it just makes sense not only environmentally, but economically to do that. And so this is where I'll leave it. This is where I'll leave it this week. Again, it's primary activities this week. Next week, we get into more of the manufacturing aspect of it. So for example, turning lumber into wood that can be used to build a house. So that's the idea of manufacturing something. Or turning all those metals into things like iPhones and tablets and computers and light bulbs and all kinds of other stuff. I hope you have a great week. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I hope you're doing well and best of luck. Bye.